start our next discussion on best practices and models for broadband adoption with Steve Johnston, Macky McCleary, Peggy Schaffer, and of course, Ashley Medeiros. So Ashley, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
This is a really good entry into the next discussion we're going to have, because as you all can see, that there's a few of us who've really been looking at how do we get more competitive markets into Rhode Island, how do we increase speed. There's a few times mentioned that I want to explain a little bit about the 48 strands of fiber optic, and Macky's here who can really kind of give a little more insight into that. And so this discussion, Macky will be here representing Rhode Island as the former director of the Department of the DPUC. And then we also have Steve Johnston from Open Cape. So it's a Massachusetts model in what he's doing. And then we also have Peggy Schaffer, who's out of Maine. And Maine is a little different than some of the challenges we face here, but their model is really great. And Andrew and Rep. Ruggiero have really talked about that collaboration, and I think this is one of the great examples. And so I'm going to start out and let them each give a little overview of their background and how they came into this, and a little bit about their organizations. Macky, do you want to get us started?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ashley, and happy to be talking about this. This is one of my favorite subjects. So background for me, now working as a management consultant for Guidehouse, which provides consulting for energy, sustainability, and infrastructure in their ESI group. But the reason I'm here talking today about Rhode Island is because for 3.5 years, I was the administrator of the Division of Public Utilities, which Rep. Ruggiero, I believe, referred to in the earlier conversation. Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, which still has some legacy authority over cable and internet. And it was my project given by the governor to work on this, even though there was not in Rhode Island, as was talked about earlier, an entity or organization that's solely responsible for broadband, both speed and ubiquity. But it was part of my project to either propose something to address that or to use private market to try to get to the end of this, the idea of internet for all, which was what we called our project. And just a little bit more background, was a management consultant for a while with McKinsey, started out in renewable energy industry and do a lot of energy infrastructure. One of the other interesting things that I will hopefully get a chance to talk about is the relationship between energy infrastructure and information infrastructure, especially as we think about ubiquity and this idea, as I think Daniela pointed out, I've forgotten who said it here in the chat, the UN declaration that essentially broadband is a human right, internet access is a human right. That puts it in a special category of commodities, and I think we need to start to evolve the way we think about delivering it as a result. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Becky. And I'm going to go to Steve Johnston from Open Cape, so he can kind of tell us a little bit about what they do and their service area, and just the great work they're doing in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. Big fan of Rhode Island. Spent a lot of time in Newport, so very familiar. Yeah, we have a fiber optic network. We went live in 2013. We were a recipient of the ARA BTOP funds. We received $32 million from the BTOP allotments, another $5 million from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in return for 12 strands of fiber on our network, and $2 million in kind and cash from a for-profit partner we had for a very limited amount of time. So in true federal grant fashion, we were able to build some 350 miles of fiber. I didn't join Open Cape until 2015, so the network was already up and live. When I joined it, we have since expanded the network to about 550 miles. We cover Cape Cod, we have fiber out to the islands, Nantucket, and we have a microwave shot to the Vineyard. We go up to One Summer and connect in Boston. And we also connect in Providence at 235 Promenade. So we service people both on southeastern Massachusetts, the Cape, the islands, and even a few clients in Rhode Island. So we have not done, we just announced our first residential deployments in the last 2 months. Our primary focus has been, at least my primary focus since joining the organization, was we ended our relationship with our for-profit partner. Their roles and responsibility were to bring people onto the network and to maintain it, and that wasn't really happening. So we terminated that relationship. We brought everything in-house. We always owned all the fiber, all the electronics. We brought sales, marketing, maintenance, all inside. And now we have a couple hundred clients. For the last few years, we've been primarily focusing on connecting businesses, large and small, towns, municipal, federal clients that are right on our network, to get them connected to the network, to make it strong and sustainable. We are well past the point of sustainability at this point. We're reinvesting back into the network, expanding the network, and that's why we're doing a variety of new things that we haven't done in the past. We will probably never expand our residential offering to the point of where we are doing all the last mile stuff. We're really working with towns about them building and owning their own local networks, and then plugging that into the Open Cape network. There's just so many financial benefits from going about it that way. But we connect a variety of clients, large and small. We're the primary for South Coast Hospitals. There are 8 locations. Cape Cod Healthcare, Joint Base Cape Cod, Bridgewater State College, a variety of large and small clients across southeastern Mass. So that's kind of what we're doing right now. And we are an anomaly because we are a 501c3. So although 99.9% of our revenue comes from operating as a successful business.
Thank you, Steve. And then we will go to Peggy Schaffer to talk about Maine and what they have going there, a little bit about her organization.
Sure. I'm the director of the ConnectME Authority. We've been around since about 2006. And we have a small, fee on broadband and landlines that help fund us. And our primary purpose is to expand infrastructure into the unserved parts of Maine. You know, Maine's kind of a big state. I think, I don't know, 7,000 Rhode Islands would fit inside of Maine. But we don't have a big population. We're like 1.3, the entire state. And so there's the significant challenge of distance and density, which is the challenge around last mile broadband is squarely in front of us. And so we work in a variety of ways. In about 2015, we put in place a community planning grant, which we provide communities funding to figure out how to expand broadband in their towns. And that does a couple things. It brings the community together in a way where they can begin to have conversations about why broadband is important, what they want it to look like for their community. It attracts providers to some extent who now have something sort of to grip onto. I often call it like sticky tape. So a provider actually can see that there's potential take rate, which is always a significant piece of how you're actually going to build out infrastructure. So we provide infrastructure grants and we provide community planning grants. We also got a BTOP funding in 2010, and we spent $31 million and built 1,100 miles of 144 strand fiber that goes up Route 1 to Fort Kent, down Route 11, takes a couple loops out to Greenville and the lakes, down through Madison, Skowhegan, over to Farmington, out to Rumford, back down in to the coast where it comes together. And so it's a 5 petabyte line. It's a significant line. We have not used it to its full extent yet. It is making money. In fact, it's making enough money that somebody bought it this year, along with New Hampshire's and Vermont's. Mostly they make money on throughput, on moving data from Boston to Quebec and to Canada. But it has provided an opportunity for a number of very small providers to begin to build out last mile with some of our money and some of their own money. So that's a start.
Yeah, thank you. So the one thing that I do want to highlight is everybody has mentioned BTOP. BTOP was Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, which was in 2010. Every state was able to access funding to build out what we call middle mile infrastructure. So that's the infrastructure that's on the main streets, on the telephone poles, or underground. Here in Rhode Island, we call our infrastructure Oceans Infrastructure, and it serves, as Representative Ruggiero said, the Meds and Eds. It's a nonprofit partner here in Rhode Island, so our businesses and residents don't have access to that BTOP fiber at this time. And in Massachusetts at the same time, and as Steve mentioned, his network comes into Providence and was built at the same time as our Ocean BTOP funded network, but they do not only serve nonprofits, they do serve businesses, and they have leveraged that to help their business community throughout Cape Cod and the islands. And as Peggy mentioned, theirs is used a little differently, but it's also a very extensive, these are really great assets. In our last panel, Andrew mentioned numerous times about if you have an infrastructure, it's much more enticing. And so that's really what I kind of want to talk about. I want to compare what we're doing here in Rhode Island, where our businesses and residents are 100% only getting their network from private companies, versus Steve's nonprofit model, versus some of the different things that Peggy is doing in Maine. So let's start with Peggy while we have her, and I want to talk. You mentioned funding multiple times. Here in Rhode Island, we haven't invested any funding. How's Maine getting funding, and what are you doing to help support this build out to your rural areas and other areas?
So our funding is it's a percent off the revenue for broadband and landlines. And so it's about a little over $1 million a year. They added additional revenue source this year of 10 cents per line, again, just on landlines, which we think is going to be probably another $500,000 a year. We thought it was going to be higher, but turns out not many people have landlines anymore. And so we use that fund for two things. One, it's the operating money for our organization. Now there's only 2 of us, so we're pretty cheap. And it's also the money that we use for infrastructure grants and for community planning grants. Our infrastructure grants, because we only have like $1 million a year, turn out to be a lot of what I refer to as filling small dark holes. So the broadband providers that we have come in and apply for money that they match, and sometimes the community matches to build out that area. What we have found with the community planning grants is people are beginning to look at how to expand service to the entire community. So instead of the provider saying, well, if I get a little money, I can build out this street or these 5 streets, the community is saying, we want fiber for everybody in our town. And they're figuring out how to combine some town money sometimes, some CapEx from a small provider, as well as our money, and now potentially some federal money, specifically through the USDA Reconnect program, to bring fiber to communities. So we have a number of sort of newish municipal fiber efforts, and they take sort of 2 forms. One is we have the ability to create a broadband utility district, which is exactly like a sewer water, only they are only it's broadband. So the same powers, the same, they can do revenue bonds, they can do other bonds, they can all the same powers that a sewer or water district has. And then we have municipal bonds, and municipal fiber owned, and that depends on the community what shape that takes and how they fund it. An island off the coast of Maine called Islesboro funded it through property tax, and not only did they fund the infrastructure build, but they also underwrite the cost of service. So they own the network, and it's operated by a small company called GWI, and they provide service, a gig service to everybody on the island for $360 a year. There are other, Cranberry Isles got a Community Connect grant, and work with Axiom. Axiom is their provider. It's municipally owned. And the Reconnect grant, Monhegan Island, Roque Bluffs, and Arousik, all are developing their own municipal broadband activity. We are seeing more people interested in this, in the utility district, because it allows you to sort of combine towns into an effort. And, you know, this is really, this gets cheaper as you build more. If you build town by town, it gets pretty expensive. But if you begin to build networks, it actually is, it's easier to get to places. And, you know, I often say you have to go through Willie's to get to the WAGs. And so the utility district often helps you do that. And so we're seeing more and more of these municipal builds, which offers a competitive edge because the town people are figuring out why they want it and what they can pay for it. And that's built into the structure of the build. Our biggest people who come in for grants, the most people who come in for grants are are small ISPs. Charter, Spectrum does some, but it's Pioneer, which is a small company in Holton. It's Premium Choice. It's Axiom, which is in Machias. It's GWI, which is in Biddeford. It's a small telco in the mid-coast area. Those are the companies that are really most active in our grant pool, because they're the most innovative. They're thinking about how to do this differently. They're working very closely with the people in their area. And that's, I think, one of the reasons they've been successful.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that we have all talked about, knowing that we have this infrastructure. Is there a way to start trying to attract companies in? And particularly Aquidneck Island has been working on this for a very long time, because I like that whole district idea, because that's something that we have definitely considered for Rhode Island. So I'm going to go to actually Steve now to tell us more about, I think, Steve, talk about, you know, what you can provide at what price points, and even explain, like, what's the difference? Like, you give fiber optic dedicated connections to your clients. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So unlike Maine, which I'm jealous now that even $1 million sounds like a windfall to get from the state. I haven't heard from anyone at MBI since 2015. MBI is the Mass Broadband Institute, and they are entirely focused on Western Massachusetts, spending about $100 million on last mile connectivity. And unfortunately, the Cape Island, Southeastern Mass have seen zero. So we have been left to our own devices to innovate, disrupt, and forge ahead and scrap for everything we basically have. And it's actually worked out pretty well, because it's forced us to be really aggressive in some senses and innovative and listen to what consumers want. So yes, even though we are a 501(c), we operate very much like a telecommunications company. 99% of our revenue does come from sales and service. We offer, right now I offer two services, well, a couple services. We offer dedicated symmetrical internet to for-profits, nonprofits. I'll come dig the hole myself to get you connected if we have to. You know, but we operate on a very lean shop. We have 11 employees, and we outsource a variety of our services, legal, accounting, even our build teams are all outsourced. I have a few build teams that we just kind of pit against each other. I'm sure one or two of them are listening right now. Our primary is Certex. They've done a great job for us. They work in collaboration with us on a lot of things. We really look at them as an extension of our own teams. But for us, it's all about being the most economical, the most organized, driving costs down. And we've seen that. And in my world, you've got the Cape, who's only served by Comcast before Open Cape. You've got the islands, where it was really kind of a free-for-all. Verizon had a foothold in one of the islands, Comcast on the other. And then in Southeastern Mass, there's a little more competition. You have Comcast, Verizon, Crown Castle, those type of things. So each one of our zones has a kind of a different business strategy, if you will. On the Cape, it's been very much, you know, living on the Cape, I mean, you guys can all relate to this because you live on the water as well, where your populations explode in the summer. You know, Falmouth goes from 30,000 people to 100,000, Provincetown from 2,000 people to 60,000. And unfortunately, Comcast's network was never really scaled to be able to absorb that. So we've kind of stepped in. I forgot to mention earlier, we run 144 strand backbone in most places, 288 in some locations where we have the most heavy usage. So we have a lot of fiber that we're utilizing, and we're using a tiny little bit of it right now, maximizing it. But we published a price list. We actually published it, and it's been in print since 2016. And so, you know, I sell 100 megs up and down symmetrical for $800. That's dedicated symmetrical. I've heard stories in Rhode Island that Cox charges $3,500, and that's insane. The good thing we're seeing, at least in our neck of the woods, Comcast has retreated significantly off their pricing. They've matched us at every point. We go head to head with them 9 or 10 times a week at least on pricing, and rarely lose. We try to really attend to customer service. Every client we have has access to all of our team. We escalate, we respond really quickly. So we're pricing our services. The dedicated symmetrical enterprise level service, you know, depends wholly on how much connectivity you want. Obviously, connecting is always an issue. You know, trying to drive that number down as low as possible. So if our fiber runs right by your building, I can connect you for probably around $3,900. That includes your Sienna 3916 gear, splice case, splicing, crew on site, patch panel, and you're up and running. So we tried to really push down pricing to make it affordable. Not that $4,000 is affordable, but for some businesses. Earlier this year in downtown Falmouth, we launched a GPON. We're using the GPON technology using the Calix equipment. And we, very funny story, the Main Street businesses in Falmouth, Mass, they couldn't process credit cards. I mean, literally, they could not process credit cards. So when you look at the effectiveness of your internet, you can't process a credit card. I mean, that's a sad statement. So we worked with the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce, the EDIC. We built out on that part of the remaining part of downtown Falmouth. 50 plus businesses signed up. We were just in the process of connecting them all when COVID-19 happened. So for us, that's something we're going to expand on, our Main Streets initiative. We already expanded to Hyannis, and we're working on that. We're also doing our first residential connections in Hyannis. So our pricing, you know, I'm happy to share. I think I've shared it with Ashley and Tooney and the representative. We share our pricing pretty freely, so there's no secrets.
Thank you. And I think the one thing my businesses in Newport would agree that in the summer, they also have very difficult time processing credit cards for small retailers because of internet connection. The one thing I like to say is not all internet is created equal. To get a dedicated connection here in Rhode Island, the cost is about $17,000. Our businesses have been quoted, versus the dedicated connection of Steve, who's charging $3,900. And so, you know, Macky, he had worked on this project and he really gets it. And he's also not here in Rhode Island. So he can kind of talk about what he would have liked to continue to work on. And, you know, he and I have had this discussion of some really great innovative things that Rhode Island could try with the infrastructure, and then maybe touch on some barriers and why is it that our costs are so different when we're so close to our counterparts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the cost is a function of the sort of similar participant to Steve and to Peggy in Rhode Island would be Ocean, and the way that their bylaws are written prevent them from providing essentially that customer-facing capability, which would control costs with competition. I mean, that's the most effective way to control costs. Is you can either regulate them down, like we do in electricity, or you can compete them down. And what you're seeing is essentially the effect of a monopoly or a duopoly in Rhode Island. Because from a middle mile point of view, Rhode Island is probably the best resource, one of the best resources places in the country, from both a density and ubiquity point of view. We've got, I used to say, there's basically a layer of soil in Rhode Island that's just fiber. It's all down there, and connecting to it and leveraging that asset for consumers has been the real challenge. I think there are a lot of, you know, as specific as that problem is to Rhode Island, I actually think the general problem of Yes, so someone actually just commented on this. Ocean can change their bylaws. It is more complicated than that, though. So I don't want to speak for Dave Marble, but it's not as simple as a pen strike. But so sorry, just go back to the larger problem. I think there's a broad policy issue, not specific to Rhode Island or Massachusetts, that is actually highlighted by Daniela, which is that from a society point of view, we've evolved to the point where internet connectivity and broadband speeds are simply a requirement for business and personal life. And in the COVID time, even more so, right? If we all have to be on Zoom calls, the taxing on throughput is really challenging. What that means is that, much like actually what you're starting to see in Maine, and which actually you see in a lot of places in the Midwest and rural areas, there's already an existing model for delivering a commodity or a valuable service to every single citizen at the lowest price possible, right? We invented that in the early part of the 20th century to deliver electricity. And there's a lot of things like that are very similar about the way we use internet to electricity. And I think we're going to start to see utilities step into this space more and more consistently, because they're really good at delivering something with 99.9999% reliability. And none of the carriers, in the way that the broadband space works, none of the carriers are capable, or and their business models aren't built for that. They're not regulated to do so. And as we're evolving into a space where machines need to talk to machines, so when two cars are autonomously driving next to one another and communicating, they can't ever drop calls. They're driving at 100 miles per hour. And so the reliability requirement is going to continue to expand. I believe, and I know that the folks at our company, we've seen this happen in Europe also, that increasingly utilities are going to be called upon, and frankly, jump in headlong into using their existing asset base to help provide broadband and other internet services to their customers, because it's necessary from an equity point of view to provide that service in a fair way, so that there aren't wild variations of price that do not correlate to variations of costs at all. So, if that makes sense.
Yes, I was trying to also follow the different comments. And so, you know, some of the things are, you know, we have this infrastructure. Why don't we have, you know, ISPs wanting to come in? And that's one of the things that we're trying to solve. And, you know, when we asked Macky about where we are right now, we have Ocean's Fiber that they can lease out. But there's been we believe some barriers in doing that. We also know that we have a regulation that we talked about earlier that we are not allowed in our legislation. So what do? We either attract more carriers using an asset that we have, but we can't figure out why somebody doesn't want to come into our market, even though that's here. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to figure out for over 2 years now. Our second is the only other way to drive it down is to regulate it like a utility, and our legislators won't allow us to do that. And so it's a very frustrating thing, as you could all see, that I've been seeing for many years now, and trying to figure out, those of us working on it, you know, what can we do, I guess, to get around that. And if anybody, Peggy or Steve or Macky, could jump in of what strategies we could use to begin leveraging an asset that we have that we're not leveraging, or we're doing something wrong. I guess that's the question.
So my idea on this was always, there's kind of two prongs. One is the utilities are all going to have to connect every single device that they own to the internet anyway. So they're either going to build their own communications network, or Verizon's, they're going to buy it from someone else. And then the second one is you have you have these sort of game-changing entrants that maybe give you an opportunity to change the way you think about infrastructure. So one of the things is we proposed in Amazon's HQ2 search that we use that opportunity as an opportunity to change the relationship between ocean and Rhode Island commerce, and essentially have our ocean fiber be a tool of the Commerce Corporation to attract business and to build out infrastructure. And so I think it's kind of, A, there's an evolution occurring on the utility side that you can leverage. B, don't waste a crisis or an opportunity. So there's, you got to take advantage of one of those two. I think that the good thing is that the base condition is so much better than what everyone else has in terms of existing resource that it's not hard to figure out a way to deliver it. The real challenge, you asked why don't they want to come in? There's just not enough people. Rhode Island's too small, and it's not an interesting enough market. That's a very simple reason, unfortunately. But also that kind of is the whole reason why we come up with these complicated regulatory models to make sure that everyone has access to things that are important. And so, you know, building it off of the existing utility relationship with customers. And look, very few people love their utility. Although the Block Island folks actually love BIPCO for some reason. They absolutely love those guys. But generally, people are mostly annoyed with their utility. At the same time, it's because the utility has done such a good job. Basically, if you were to think about where we were 100 years ago when electricity was invented, which is similar to where, more than 100 years ago, 120, 130 years ago, similar to where we are with internet now, the idea that every single human being in the United States, regardless of where they live, would have access to two things, electricity and television, would be, people would call you a madman or a mad person, crazy person. We essentially take electricity for granted because they have been effective at delivering it so consistently for the last 60 years. If we get to that place with broadband, I think we'll be going in the right direction.
I think Mackie's hit the nail on the head when he talked about population. I mean, Open Cape faces the same issue. We have this fantastic open access, state-of-the-art network with tons of fiber, and we couldn't attract an ISP. So we have to de facto become an ISP, which was not the original model. And you know, it takes a while to get that ball rolling, but now it's really rolling. And now, you know, the one positive I can say from COVID-19 is it has shown the spotlight on the importance of connectivity. And now everyone wants to connect. And we're lucky in the sense that I've got a brand new network. We were down less than 5 minutes all of last year. And most of that was just maintenance related stuff. So, you know, people have a really good feeling about us. And we've worked hard in the community to build those relationships, to expand our network, to connect people. And we've got a variety of scenarios. You know, we connect Penakees Island off the coast of the Elizabeth Islands. There's a school out there. We shoot them out a signal. For the last 7 years, they've had a signal. So we're trying to make some level of accessibility available to everyone if we can. You know, we have the National Seashore. That's always a challenge. But it is, you know, kind of combating the incumbents it's an arduous process, and you've got to kind of work your way through that.
What I tell people in Maine, communities in Maine, because we have a lot less density, is if you don't have broadband now, you're not going to get it unless you do something about it. And that really means having that community conversation, figuring out what your businesses are in town, what they need. Most of our anchor institutions, schools and libraries, are covered by the Maine School Library Network. They have about 100 meg up and down to all schools and libraries in the state, with the exception of a couple islands. But and so there is a connectivity there, and that has drastically changed how our schools and libraries work. I mean, completely changed what they do. And it just really, it takes the community to grab a hold of this. I think the reason we have so many small providers is because there was an opportunity where the big providers were just not doing it. And so there was a door for small people with a lower operating cost who didn't have a big corporate giant to respond to jump in. And they were also, I will say, the people who do it are the people who are really committed to the community that they live in. Because these guys all moved to fiber before anybody else did. They learned pretty quick that wireless was not a good strategy for Maine. And they looked long-term and said, if we're going to own this area, if we're going to build out this area, we're going to make sure everybody has fiber. So our small guys have been running fiber for 5 or 6 years. And we're still fighting with our big telco to get anything above, 10.1, they continually stand in front of meetings and say, you don't need more than 25.3 ever. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And that's that's what a community planning grant does to some extent, is it brings people together to tell those people that kind of service isn't going to work for us. And if you don't build a better service and we'll help you figure out how to do that, we're going to go someplace else. And it really takes that community effort to push those organizations into it and to open the doors for the small organizations.
I think that's the one thing. It's that understanding. Yeah, 25 is nothing. That's not enough in my house for a computer and my daughter's iPad at this point. The other thing I'd like to say, and I always like to say this, is what we have here, we don't have, unless you're a larger company and you've paid the very high cost to get a fiber optic connection from the telephone pole to your premise, that last mile, we are still running on cable coax. And so if you look at your router in your house right now, it's the cable line coming in, and that's different than fiber. Fiber allows a dedicated connection. So if you're paying for 100 megabits, you are getting 100 megabits to your house. 25 megabits of fiber, yeah, that's enough for my house. 25 megabits of coax is not, because essentially coax, how it's split, you're sharing that with all of your neighbors. And so if you're finding any speeds earlier in the day because the kids are all on their computers doing homework, it's slower. Right now it might have sped up because they're all done doing homework and it's a nice day outside and playing. So I always like to say, if you ever wonder why at 5 o'clock on a normal winter day when it's dark, your computer slows down, as mine does immediately, it's because every kid is on their tablet or on their gaming system and it's slowing it. But here in Rhode Island, that's not an option for us. We don't have any providers who are providing fiber to home connections. And they are providing fiber to business, but the cost is just absurd. And I think, as we go in, that connection is important. I also like to talk a little bit, this is about broadband, but I also want to touch on 5G, because there is a perception that 5G is going to save Rhode Island and save the world. Could anybody speak to that, of the differences and what your thoughts are, and what are the barriers to just waiting it out and hoping for the best for 5G?
5G is fiber, deep fiber to every community. You got to have a fiber base to get 5G. I mean, I think eventually, it's important because people, when you use a device, you go from your house to your car, and you as an individual expect ubiquity in that coverage. You do expect, and so 5G is going to be important for that, but it is based on deep fiber in every community. And that does not exist, at least doesn't exist in Maine, and doesn't exist in most places. So it's got promise, but we got to build fiber first.
Yeah. So I agree. The fiber backhaul is important. It actually does exist in Rhode Island. We've got plenty of fiber for the 5G network. The challenge for 5G is the carriers don't do ubiquity, and they can't, right? And they own the spectrum for the most part. Now there are a couple, so I'm not going to try not to get too technical, but 5G spectrum, most of that 5G spectrum is really high frequency, short wavelength, which means that it doesn't propagate very well. So it doesn't go very far, which means you need lots of little small cells. There is some additional 5G spectrum in the TV range that's coming online with ATSC 3.0, which could be a really interesting competitor to it because it's very long range and it propagates very well because it's TV spectrum, and there's a ton of it. The challenge is that those licenses are issued essentially locally, just like radio licenses. And so putting together a network across it is not easy, but there are a few folks trying to do that. The reason why people are interested in 5G is because it's the closest thing, it's not the closest thing, but it gets to what they call zero latency. Zero latency means that there's essentially, you're really operating at the speed of light. There's no discernible difference between the moment you transmit something and the moment that it's received by the other entity. And what that allows you to do a lot of industrial, mechanical, and machine processes in ways that keep people safe. I think it could be really interesting. 5G as a technology, I think the thing is, it's not an answer, it's an outcome, right? It's not going to solve everything for us if we don't have the right regulatory and delivery model. It's just a technology. And right now, that technology, for the most part, is owned by wireless carriers who aren't very interested in some of the policy outcomes that we're interested in. That won't be the case forever. And I think we have some options to use that technology along with existing infrastructure that's already ubiquitous to deliver a statewide solution. The other thing that I get a little nervous about with 5G is that it's actually just one piece of spectrum. There's a bunch of different spectrum that has that purpose. This is just the most recent auction. 6G spectrum is going to be, actually, I think it's going to be longer wave. So there's a lot of other spectrum coming down. What we really mean is anything 5G and beyond has a set of capabilities that everything that came before it from a wireless point of view did not. And so it's like the lower limit of capability for future proofing for most types of technology. And that's why it's so important from a both a business attraction and a commerce point of view, is that it really is going to lay the foundation for smart cities and slowly transform the way we interact with our lives in our homes. But the real challenge is, from a policy point of view, how do we get ubiquity? How do we make sure that everyone has access in the entire state? And that's really the challenge for policymakers. And to some extent, I mean, I wouldn't at all be surprised if one of the large internet titans decides to just do this. Google did this with fiber, but fiber is really expensive for the last mile. So the idea that they would do that for the entire nation, they realized that even they could not afford that. But I wouldn't be surprised to see one of the other titans, what could also be Amazon, start to make a play in this space because they benefit from it. And so it could happen.
I also think that 5G, and Peggy hit the nail on the head, it's wholly dependent on fiber. I mean, those numerous amounts of radios that are pushing the 5G signal out have to connect to fiber. And then you have the same issue again with density. So if you don't have enough density to have fiber in your neighborhood or last mile connectivity, then you're not going to really have 5G. And we're telling people on the Cape, like, don't hold your breath. Maybe in 10 years, you'll see 5G here, despite what it says on your phone. I mean, occasionally 5G shows up on my phone here in Sandwich, and I'm quite certain that I don't have a 5G connection.
Yeah, that's just AT&T messing with your head.
Yeah, exactly. And they did the same thing with 4G. And
yeah.
So, you know, a wired connection is always going to be the desired way to go in terms of your business, your core. Yes, 5G is a nice complementary technology. I would absolutely agree with that comment.
And so I think, you know, we've got 5 more minutes. Let's talk about the future. So where do we need to go? I mean, we're finding right now the challenges of not having enough built up to be able to support everything we're doing today. Let's multiply this by 10 of what the technology advances and how quickly they are. You know, what can states do, or what are your states doing to prepare so that we can continue to generate commerce and support education and different things, you know, well into the future?
I mean, we're focusing on right now, I mean, all our effort right now, besides the COVID-19 response, you know, we started, the minute that happened, we offered all of our clients 100% free bandwidth upgrades, you know, whatever they needed. They had 50 megs and they wanted a gig, no problem, done. And we've currently upgraded, I think, 53 clients so far that wanted that. But we're putting a lot of effort into planning for the next round of infrastructure dollars that are going to flow, to make sure we're communicating properly, that we're out there talking to the right people that says, look, we took BTOP money, we made a success of it, we're making this happen. We want to see more dollars come our way so we can do X, Y, and Z. So we really want to have a plan in place. We just don't want to see all those funds go to 5G or whatnot. I mean, AT&T and Verizon, they don't need the money. Smaller folks like ConnectME and Open Cape and Ocean, we all need the money to really make a huge difference. So I think, you know, if you're not doing that right now, you're already behind the 8 ball. I mean, for the last 5 weeks, we've been doing that.
Peggy, do you want to add any final?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to have to be, in Maine, we estimate the size of our hole to be in excess of $600 million, and that's just to connect people. That's not, you know, that's going outside the cable footprint. If we want to build inside the cable footprint, it gets a lot higher than that. and so that's not going to be the state alone. It has to be state, federal, and local, as well as providers in partnership. And, you know, I have various opinions about the federal government and how they distribute money, none of which are good or actually sayable in a public space. But they, there is a significant amount of money going out to auction on really bad data this fall. The RDOF auction is based on the FCC's incredibly horrible data. And that for rural states, that is really painful. For more urban states like you, it's also really painful because it doesn't help you connect your inner cities. You have to have no connection essentially to be in it. And so even though that is USF money that everybody's paying into, it does nothing to help bridge the gap in the urban areas, which is just as bad as it is in the rural areas. And that's what people don't talk about, is that there are lots of places in this country, whether you're urban or rural, that you do not have connectivity. And right now we are trying to solve a rural problem without thinking about how to solve the urban problem. And that's a problem. And also we don't ever think about cost. What's it going to cost at the end? And people have to be able to, for people to use this technology like it needs to be used, you have to be able to afford it. And right now, at the federal level, there's nobody looking at cost and how to bring this to a level where people can actually afford it.
For the pilot, for the residential pilot we're launching, we're doing a shared gigabit at $55 a month.
Yeah, I mean, but that to me, that's a great example, Steve, because you get the idea of having either a nonprofit or a utility type entity that can do this is really the only way you're going to answer Peggy's cost question. And frankly, it's interesting because in electricity utilities, we're having the same conversations about what is the actual value proposition for investor-owned utilities in a realm in which there's no load growth to share. And I'm not going to get into the details of this, but a lot of the things that we thought were going to happen when they changed electricity regulation in the 90s are not true anymore. And as the electricity system breaks apart and remakes itself, and the lights are going to continue turning on, I think there's a really big opportunity for us to think about how we deliver this commodity as well. Socializing the cost across the culture like electricity does seems like a reasonable model. Nonprofit co-op entities are already providing services like these all throughout the country, electricity and bandwidth. And I'll tell you one last thing I'll say. Utilities have among the worst customer satisfaction in all of the business world, except for co-op utilities, which people love. They are the highest, and it's because it's part of your community, right? They're delivering a valuable commodity, and it's your community. So thinking about that, those people who are invested locally, some products like this one, even though components of it are delivered globally, right? They kind of need to be and want to be so community driven. Waste, trash wants to stay home. Electricity really does want to be managed at the community level, even if there's a global and regional system that delivers significant parts of it. You know, things that are critical to the functioning of your community naturally tend to want to be managed at that level. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Whenever we talk about speeds, here's the thing to remember. We don't ever think about technology with our electricity or our water or any of those things. You get as much water as you need. You get as much electricity as you need. It should be the same thing with your broadband connection. You should get as much as you need.
I agree. I like that.